and focus on lesbian and gay rights alone, which left those fighting for transgender rights with much less community support.
A well-known example, GLAAD, formerly known as the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, is an organization in which their goal is to promote lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer equality. Although they display this as their campaign, GLAAD is guilty of previously ignoring the bi and trans community, as well as constructing their transgender alliance with very little information about the community itself. In order to start fully supporting trans individuals, they must, quote, make all kinds of trans people visible in their campaigns, including those who don't medically transition, those who aren't white, and those who don't present as gender normative, end quote.
Another problem the trans community has faced over the years is deliberate mislabeling, in which persons use the wrong pronouns even after the person has come out. This can be seriously detrimental to the individual's concept of identity and self-confidence.
People in the LG community have gone to lengths to propose that the T in LGBTQ+ should be abandoned, forgetting or, quote, intentionally alienating, end quote, it. Some LGBT activists have even gone as far to insist that the trans community is solely there to, quote, infiltrate the gay and lesbian movement to destroy it, end quote, as one man stated at a conference for LG rights.
On the contrary, transgender individuals have been recognized in history as major influencers in the normalization and acceptance of the LGBT community as a whole, both specifically for trans rights and for the rights of all LGBT people. In the Stonewall riots, 2 African American transgender women began the protest.
The transgender community has been active in marches and protests for queer rights since the fight began in the 1960s and 1970s, yet still have to struggle in gaining support from their own community.
For example, the Compton's cafeteria riot in San Francisco in 1966 was a trans-focused riot that rebelled against trans individuals not being permitted in gay bars due to transphobia, and it was a first step in organized transgender activism. The riot has often been described as, quote, similar to Stonewall, yet dismissed as not newsworthy or politically relevant, end quote, due to its ties with transgender rather than LG activism.
As Valencia Rose Dumas, a trans woman, regretfully stated, quote, gay men don't want us around because we are not men. Lesbians don't want us around because they don't consider us women. The rest treat us like a fetish or see us as drag queens, end quote.
Next, we have some discussion questions that we will be examining about the struggle for trans rights and social equality. These next statements are largely our opinions based on evidence we have gathered to date. Here we go.
Was the trans community ever guilty of putting bisexual rights or any other marginalized group after their own? Could they blame it on the disparity between groups, sexuality versus gender?
I think that the trans community, without even meaning to, could have excluded bisexuals and or any other marginalized group from the conversation. I believe this has to do a lot with the contrast between different sexuality and gender identities.
Personally, I've heard news stories of people in the drag and trans community who have sidelined LGBT groups or outrightly declared their adversity to non-heterosexual identities, although not as often as I see transphobic opinions from members of the non-heterosexual-sized gender community.
If the trans community consciously excluded other queer groups, they most likely only left out those of queer sexualities for lack of similarities.
As a way to bring others into this discussion, we interviewed some of our peers, some of whom wished to remain anonymous. One of the most popular questions we asked was, is there any confrontation seen in the queer community between people of varying sexualities and people of different genders? If so, to what extent? Here are some of the answers we received.
An anonymous person simply said,
yes.
Another said,
yes, I have seen conflict within the LGBT community. Sometimes I see people having arguments that have the sole purpose of someone trying to prove one group has it worse than another. I have also seen arguments about which groups are really LGBT. Neither of these serves any real purpose at all.
In agreement, Melanie, who identifies with she/they pronouns, said,
definitely. Being part of the LGBTQ+ community is like being part of any other community. People will have their opinion and may not see eye to eye.
We asked people what they think would have happened if the 2 trans people didn't start the riot. Would Stonewall just be another case of police meddling? Or would another person have stepped up that night?
One person said,
I think someone would have stepped up and done something.
and another responded with,
I don't know if the riots would have begun that night, but I do think someone would have eventually snapped and taken a similar stand.
Viviana says,
Oh, if two white gay guys started it rather than black trans women, I definitely feel like there would be more sections in the history books dedicated to Stonewall.
why doesn't a lot of the community credit what is known as the beginning of the gay rights movements to these two trans icons? What's so hard about it?
The first anonymous response was,
I feel that maybe it was discrimination at the beginning, and over time, as people did not have the opportunity to find out about the trans community, they faded into the background and we ignored more accidentally.
Melanie responded with,
In all honesty, if, say, the Stonewall riots were started by a homosexual man, then he would be considered an influential icon in the LGBTQ+ community. When one thinks of the term gay, they think of homosexuals, not necessarily trans people. When people think LGBTQ+ representation, they don't think of people who are genderqueer or trans. This perhaps may be the reason why it is difficult for people, in the community or not, to realize the influence these two icons had.
To wrap it up, the Stonewall riot may not have recognized the two icons to their fullest extent because the image that people get when they think of the queer community is simply a gay man. Another factor is the total lack of knowledge within the queer community of the trans community. We then proposed the question, why has the queer community, specifically those who identify with non-heterosexual sexualities, continued to be so cold towards gender identities within the LGBTQ+ umbrella? Have you witnessed this disparity personally? And if so, what was it like?
Anonymous said. Another responded with,
I don't honestly know why non-heterosexual people are cold towards those who are not cisgender. My best guess is that although the LGBT community groups all of those identities together, some non-straight people still don't entirely support trans people for some reason, as it's not so similar to being gay for them to immediately accept it. No, I haven't personally seen this.
Melanie also stated,
Hatred is a strong force. It can bring people together and draw them apart just as easily. Unfortunately, there are people who are not heterosexual that are transphobic. Being trans is not something that people do for attention or because they decide they want to be a homosexual and the only way to do that is by changing themselves. These are opinions that, unfortunately, I have witnessed in other people.
One of the ideas that someone mentioned was internalized homophobia, a topic we touched on in the first episode. But there is the undeniable fact that there are lots of people that use difference in identities as a reason to ostracize or hate another group. That brings us to the end of the pure discussion and also of our podcast episode. Thank you to our anonymous commentators and to our guest speakers, as well as our voice actors. This has been Conflict and Compromise, the LGBT+ community. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in for our next edition, The AIDS Crisis.